So tonight, this is the Cruising Division's second talk of this winter season of lectures. There will be questions and answers at the end, so if you've got any observations, questions or comments, Steve would love to be able to hear them. And Steve, perhaps because we won't be running around the room with the microphone, if you could repeat the question and then give your answer, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Steve's previously been to the club and given a very interesting talk, which I'm sure many of you saw, which was Spitfires of the Sea, about the coastal motorboats. And he's also very generously gave us a Zoom lecture about embarking the D-Day Armada in the ad hoc spring series that we ran on Zoom only. So this is actually the original booking that we made for Steve, and we're very fortunate to have him here tonight. So I'd like to give you all to give a big hand of applause. And I invite Steve Fisher to give us Embarking the D-Day Armada. Steve.
Thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, in this very weird year that we find ourselves in, and quite a complex setup to try and get this presentation working. I hope everything works fine. It seems to be. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys this talk. So I was invited back to talk about some of the work that I do along the south coast of England. And one of my areas of interest and expertise, I suppose I can say, is the embarkation of the D-Day forces from the south coast of England. And this is more than just a hobby for me. This is actually a line of work, because over the past couple of years I've actually been the heritage advisor for the restoration of Landing Craft Tank 7074, which is this fantastic Mark III landing craft, D-Day survivor, that was brought down to Portsmouth from Liverpool by the National Museum of the Royal Navy and has now been restored, and some of you may have seen in the news, was only just recently moved to its new home outside the D-Day story in Southsea. This is how it looked when it came out of the Mersey up at Liverpool, and it's much improved, and it's due to open, fingers crossed, next month, which has already been delayed several months, of course. But I do urge you to go and have a look at it. You can go on board, you can explore the whole thing, and you'll see how completely different it looks to the wreck in this slide. So that's been an absolutely fantastic project to be involved in, and I just discovered from your secretary that I was actually in the newspaper. I didn't realise I was in, was it the Express? Yes. Which is delightful. So yes, it's definitely in the news. If you haven't heard of this, then I don't know where you've been. So this line of work, this embarkation of the D-Day forces and the route in which they got from the south coast of England over to Normandy has always been of interest to me, and it's something that I've studied quite a lot. And I think it's really a story worth telling, because when you think about D-Day, you tend to think of images like this, the arrival of the Allied forces off the beaches of Normandy and the successful landings on the 6th of June. Or you might think about the longer campaign that was fought in Normandy through the following months up until August, when the Allies broke out of their beachhead and advanced across Europe. Or you may think about some of the very well-known locations associated with D-Day, such as Pegasus Bridge, which was captured in that fantastic overnight assault on the night of 5th, 6th of June, or some of the structures that are quite well known and quite established in Normandy, the famous Atlantic Wall and the concrete bunkers here of Lons-sur-Mer, just to the west of Arromanches. Here in the UK, we do have our own buildings and infrastructure associated with D-Day, of course. This is Southwark House, near Portsmouth, and this was one of the headquarters for SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. This is where Eisenhower made the decision to launch the invasion on the night of the 4th, 5th of June. And around, there's the map room, the famous map room that shows the route of all of the invasion convoys heading to the French coast. Around the rest of the south, we do have lots of other structures associated with D-Day. This training wall in Surrey, Hankley Common, was a wall that was built and designed to be tested upon with various explosive devices so that the Allies could practice breaching anti-tank walls on the various routes off of the beaches in Normandy. This is Fort Henry on the Dorset coast. This was the observation bunker that was used for Operation Smash, the slightly disastrous experiment or training exercise, if you like, with swimming tanks that was conducted in April of 1944. But what I'm most interested in is the actual embarkation, the gathering of the fleet, primarily of landing craft in the ports along the south coast of England, and the embarkation of all of the armed forces, the army and the armour that got onto these vessels, and how they managed to achieve that, because it really was quite a fantastic undertaking, not just to organise the landing craft and the vessels, but to organise the men on shore and get them safely onto their vessels. And this really is one of the areas that interests me the most. And we're quite lucky with the embarkation because we have far more footage, including like this genuine colour footage filmed by the Canadians of that embarkation. Once you get across to the other side, there is film footage, but for quite obvious reasons, it's not quite as professionally shot. So that embarkation was a very complicated process, and it used a variety of facilities along the south coast of England. Now, some of those are very ephemeral. They were temporary facilities that were constructed purely for the embarkation of the troops, such as this pier that was built next to Southsea Pier in Portsmouth. And it's very much a temporary structure, as you can see, using scaffolding primarily to get the troops out to deeper water so that they could embark on their vessels. And once the war was finished, that was packed up and removed, and it's left no visible trace on the ground. Other facilities that were used were existing dock facilities, such as Southampton Docks, that was built in the late 20s and 30s. And so all of these existing ports and harbours and facilities along the south coast were used as well. So they don't show any change associated with D-Day so much, and they were existing structures not built purely for the invasion. But there were a number of facilities that were built just for D-Day. Well, in fact, slightly more than D-Day, but this is what they're most well remembered for. Up and down the south coast of England, purpose-built embarkation hards were constructed for the use of landing craft. And it's these that have perhaps left the most visible archaeological and historical trace in estuaries and ports all around the south coast. Now, to understand why these facilities came to be built, it's worth talking about the evolution of vessels within the Royal Navy. When the war started, we really only had two types of landing craft. The very famous landing craft Assault, which was developed in the very late 1930s. We had a handful of these when war broke out, capable of carrying a platoon of men and landing in shallow waters on a beach. The other vessel was the landing craft Mechanized, which could carry a few more men or small armoured vehicles, as you can see here, carrying universal carriers. But they couldn't really carry larger vehicles like tanks. And after we withdrew from Europe, after Dunkirk in 1940, it was very quickly realised that we would need to return to the European continent. And in order to do that, we would need a far wider array of amphibious vessels capable of landing far more forces on enemy-held beaches than our existing types of landing craft. In particular, what we would need would be landing craft that could carry tanks. And so in late 1940, the very first landing craft tanks were built. The Mark I was quickly followed by the Mark II, seen here. That was then followed by a Mark III, which is what landing craft tank 7074 is, and then by the Mark IV, when America came into the war, by the Mark V, and then later the Mark VI and Mark VII landing craft. The net result, by the time of D-Day, Britain alone had built 1,155 landing craft tank of 4 different classes, and to those can be added another 1,988 US-built landing craft tank as well. In total, more than 800 of this class of vessel took part in the D-Day landings. We also had the far larger landing ship tank, which was an ocean-going vessel. And as you can see, the primary differences here is a much taller vessel, and it has bow doors, so it's capable of crossing wider oceans and carrying far more armour, up to 20 tanks. But this picture also shows one of the problems that you get with landing craft, and that is that people and vehicles embark and disembark through the bow, because they are primarily, of course, intended to land on a beach. And that meant that existing port and dock facilities all around the coast of England weren't particularly useful because they have high quayside walls or wharfs, and there's nowhere for a landing craft to come alongside for you to easily get vehicles into it without the use of a crane. Now, another one. Now, because troops are primarily meant to go on and off through the door, that's fine when you get to the other side where you're landing on a beach, but it means that you need to have facilities on the south coast of England to embark troops. Now you could of course just use a beach, but the problem with that is that you need to find the right sort of beach with the right sort of ground. And Dieppe, on the other side of the channel, showed the problem of different beaches on the south coast. And you know, if you use shingle for heavy tanks, you're going to have a really difficult time getting all of your vehicles onto your landing craft efficiently. So what you really need is a very hard surface, a very even surface. What you essentially need is your own concrete beach. And that was what was constructed along the south coast. In 1942, combined operations under Lord Louis Mountbatten issued orders for brand new embarkation hards to be constructed. One in Poole, one here in Lymington, one at Leap in the New Forest, 4 at Stokes Bay in Gosport, and 2 at Shoreham-on-Sea and 2 at Newhaven. Even before construction of this had begun, the Admiralty very quickly realised that they would need far more than this, and a whole new programme of construction was announced, including, and you can't quite see it I'm afraid, 5 down at Falmouth, 5 at Plymouth, 5 in the Torbay and Dart Estuary area, 3 at Portland, 1 at Poole, 3 in the New Forest, 4 at Southampton, 6 at Gosport, 2 at Shoreham-on-Sea, 3 at Newhaven, apologies, 2 at Hastings, how many was that? That was 5 at Hythe and Folkestone, 5 at Dover, 4 at Deal, and then round onto the Medway there were 3 there. Over at Tilbury there were another 6, and then up on the dark water there were 2 up there. At Felixstowe there were 4, and then over in Wales there were 3 over in the Port Talbot area and another 3 at Milford Haven. There were another 3 up in Scotland, and all told that came to, I'm sure you've all counted it up in your head, Sergeant Lee, it was about 76 embarkation hards with enough berthing facilities for more than 200 landing craft all at the same time. And many of these were built in existing dock facilities. So this is Southampton in 1946, and in fact there are 3 embarkation hards here. Now some of them are quite easy to spot. You can see the long pier sticking out into the water, and there you can in fact see 4 landing craft berthed alongside the pier, and here is the embarkation hard itself. Here's another one. This is where Red Funnel is now, and this is Mayflower Park, and that's embarkation hard S1 next to the pumps. So these were able to take advantage of the existing facilities in a modern harbour or port, and so all of the good road infrastructure, the networks that connected them were already provided. But many embarkation hards were also built in the countryside, in quite rural, isolated locations on fairly quiet stretches of water, such as this one at, I've forgotten the name of the gardens, Trebar Gardens, just outside Falmouth on the River Helford. And you can see again the pier sticking out into the water, and that's it really, because these are very simple facilities. As I said, they're essentially a concrete beach, and the construction was basically in 2 parts. First, you'd have your upper, what was called an apron, the parking area above the high water mark, and that's the area indicated in red on this. And then you would have, and that apron was very carefully designed to allow vehicles to easily manoeuvre onto it and access the landing craft. So you'll see here these arrows indicate that actually it's designed for vehicles to be able to drive onto the apron from the concrete access road, and then very slowly, oops, sorry, I went too fast, and then reverse onto the landing craft. So it's a very simple trick, but the concrete layout has been very carefully designed to allow that to happen. Now that was actually a plan of Leap embarkation hard at Leap in the New Forest, and you can still see how much of that survives today. You can see all of that concrete apron, some of it covered in gravel, just there. But this picture also shows one of the problems with constructing your concrete beach, and that is that this picture was taken at low tide. Oh, sorry. And then, of course, the tide comes in, and that makes it very difficult to set concrete because the tide is, of course, coming in just as you're trying to harden your beach. So the solution to this was proposed by a Royal Engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Vassall Steer Webster, and his solution was to prefabricate the concrete that would be in the intertidal area. And he designed a prefabricated beach hardening mat, a flexible concrete mat that could be formed in a workshop anywhere in the country and then taken out to the beach and laid across the surface. Now, the initial design of this was designed to be flexible so it could be laid over the undulating surface of the beach, but that did reveal some early design problems in that after vehicles had driven over it quite a lot, you ended up with quite an undulating surface as well. And so the Mark II, in fact the final version was the Mark IIB beach hardening mat, was much more rigid with metal reinforcement hooks passing through them to connect each of the beach hardening mats to one another so that you would have a rigid and complete surface. And these were the beach hardening mats that were laid across the vast majority of those 76 embarkation hards around the country. They could be very easily created using unskilled labour in small or large workshops all across the country, so they didn't require a massive amount of investiture in their production. And then they could be taken to the embarkation hards and laid in the intertidal area. And you can see from this footage that they were capable of taking quite a pounding, and they were more than capable of standing up to the tanks that would be driving over them. You might also see why they have this nickname, chocolate blocks. Now, I still haven't found out if that was a nickname that was used at the time or one that has been applied to them in the last 20 years or so that these structures have been being researched. So I haven't found any contemporary evidence of that nickname, so I'll refer to them as beach hardening mats. And essentially these would be laid all across the intertidal area to create your hard surface. It could be done at low tide, and then by the time the tide comes in, of course, it's already set, it's already there. And that gives you your primary concrete beach. The only other facilities that you really need are a pier for the vessels to moor against, and also for troops to go along so they can get onto the sides of vessels as well. These were primarily of timber construction with scaffolding in between them to create a continuous pier for troops to walk along. And then once you've built all of that, you have your embarkation hard. And this one on the Medway is taken from the pier, and you can see the large area of the beach hardening mats there in the middle, and then up at the top you can see the concrete apron. Now that one's actually, if you look closely, been painted because one of the problems with all of these new facilities popping up along the south coast on beaches or on river estuaries was that they were quite obvious from above with all of this lovely light grey brand new concrete. And so to counter this problem, many of them were actually camouflaged by painting over that surface, and you can see this is actually all concrete, but it's been painted to help it blend in with the landscape around it. And of course in the intertidal area, nature takes care of that itself, and you get a large deposit of growth and marine growth and seaweed which helps cover that surface. But of course, in order to use these facilities, it's necessary for vehicles and troops to be able to reach them. Now that's fine in a port like Southampton, where, as I said, the existing road infrastructure is already there, but at some of the more rural locations, and across the vast majority of the south coast of England in the 1930s and 1940s, we didn't have a huge number of concrete or tarmac roads. Most roads were still what were known as macadam roads, which is a design that had been in use since the 19th century. In fact, it wasn't until a Welshman by the name of Hooley, I believe, accidentally mixed tar with a macadam road surface that he realised that was a much more hardy surface, and so tar macadam, now tarmac, came into use in the early 1900s. This is an old macadam road near Farley Mount, in Farley Mount near Winchester, and it's heavily overgrown, but the surface underneath that grass is still very firm. But it is essentially just a sort of packed gravel road onto a clay surface, and you can see that sort of structure in this pothole just here. It's great for vehicles and occasional use, but if you were to start driving tanks across it on a regular basis, it wouldn't survive for long. And so it was necessary to improve all of these roads leading to the embarkation hards in order to make sure that tanks in particular would be able to reach them. And so a massive building programme was carried out to support these embarkation hards in 1942 and 1943. And primarily they would resurface existing roads with 3 inches of tar macadam and occasionally strengthen them, as you can see, with concrete haunches or concrete sides to the roads to prevent it from collapsing over the edges. And this was a typical improvement carried out along coastal roads all along the south coast. And here you can see on this plan at Mount Edgecombe on the west side of Plymouth Harbour that a 3-inch tar macadam surfacing was to be laid on the existing carriageway, minimum width of 12 foot. But also there was even greater infrastructure. There was a concrete carriageway 30 foot wide and 8 inches thick to be laid. And concrete really was the mass construction material that could be used for the vast majority of these roads all along the south coast. And going back to Leap Country Park again, you can see that they required the construction of a new concrete road that was actually just over a mile long to head from Stone Farm up near the main road network all the way down to the embarkation hard on the waterfront. And not just that, but they would also require more facilities to support those roads. And on this plan again of Leap and Leap Country Park, for those of you who know it, is just here. That's where the car park is. Here's Stanswood Bay and embarkation hard Q2, and then Leap House is just there. There's another embarkation hard Q1 built just there. Here they required the construction of PPs to be provided where necessary at intervals of 200 yards along the main road north up to Langley. Those PPs, short for passing places, what they actually needed to construct was lay-bys in the road for vehicles that had broken down or for oncoming vehicles to pull into so that a convoy could go past. And the War Office even issued specifications for these lay-bys so that they would be the correct size, 22 foot wide across a length of 45 foot, to make sure that they all were standardised and would all meet the requirements for road traffic. And these were constructed all along the south coast of England. Now this is on the east coast of the River Fowl down in Cornwall. Every one of those red dots is where a passing place is to be installed. So they're essentially a brand new construction programme of lay-bys along the south coast's roads. Sometimes they needed to go even further in order to provide sufficient passing places for convoys. So this is a passing place marked out in red, and the cross-hatched areas, the shaded areas rather, those are people's houses, and they're going to need to be removed in order to provide this passing place on a narrow road just outside Plymouth. And then in 1944, as the invasion got closer and they realised just how big the invasion force was going to be, even bigger than had been anticipated in 1943, they realised they would need to widen even more roads along the south coast of England. And so a massive programme, primarily carried out by civilian contractors, was carried out to widen existing roads. And this is Jacob's Gutter Lane in Totton, and all along the south coast in Southampton in the New Forest, roads were widened to make sure that convoys would be able to fit down them. Some of you might recognise this. If you don't know what it is, I'll tell you a bit later, but shortly after the spring of 1944, all along the south coast you could see these typical white stripes down the sides of roads where they had been widened to accommodate all of those convoys. And when it came to D-Day, most of these roads were closed off to the public in order to make sure that there were completely uncluttered routes to all of the embarkation facilities. This is Tor Bay, and Dartmouth is just down here. Here's, thank you, I knew someone would know, and there's Torquay. All of those red roads are roads that have been primarily closed to the public and are access routes for troops to get from their marshalling camps to the embarkation facilities at Brixham, Torquay and Dartmouth. And what the startling thing is, and something that goes incredibly unappreciated a lot of the time, is that it worked. The entire invasion force in the week before D-Day, in fact less than a week, in 5 days, were able to move from their marshalling areas down to their vessels that would carry them across the channel with hardly any hiccups. No ships were delayed in their sailing on the 5th of June because they had all completed the required schedule of embarking their troops in the previous days. And so the entire invasion force was able to sail to schedule with all of the correct units on all of the correct vessels. It is a massive logistical undertaking to achieve that, and something that is often forgotten because most attention, of course, is directed to the beaches of France. In total, there were 74 separate points of embarkation for D-Day forces along the south coast of England, and more than half of them, 39 in fact, were these purpose-built embarkation hards. So of those 76, not all of them were used, but on the build-up to D-Day, more than half of the facilities were actually these embarkation hards, and the vast majority of armour and tanks and vehicles passed over these to get onto their landing craft because the existing docks of Southampton and Plymouth and Portsmouth weren't really suitable. So it was this preparation that had been made in 42-43 that made this possible. And after the landing craft had taken their troops over to France and dropped them off on the morning of the 6th of June, and then throughout the rest of the day as the forces that had been arranged with a careful timetable unloaded their troops, the landing craft then very quickly turned around and went back to the United Kingdom to pick up more troops and to start building up the forces in Normandy. In fact, it was necessary to keep sending troops over to build ourselves up from the initial 5 divisions that landed to something like 20 divisions by the middle of the next month. And so the landing craft were then engaged in a continuous shuttle service across the English Channel, dropping off troops and then sailing back across to pick up their forces, usually sailing to France at night when it was safer and when they were carrying their precious cargo of troops, and then returning to England in daylight when they were slightly more expendable, is the unfortunate way to describe it. Of course, they weren't always coming back empty. Quite often they were bringing wounded back, but also prisoners of war. And this is Portsmouth Harbour. This is a photograph taken from Gosport Hardway, which is still a sailing club now and was an embarkation hard during the war. In the background you can see Portsdown Hill. But of course it wasn't always a safe journey, and as I said, most of them were having to return during daylight hours when they were more easily observed from the air and by German submarines. This landing craft on the River Itchen in Southampton has just managed to get back after being torpedoed by a torpedo that hit just forward of the bridge, and they're very lucky it didn't break the landing craft in two. I still don't know what actually happened to this landing craft. There's a very good chance they wrote it off. But the Admiralty had prepared for this possibility that a lot of the landing craft would be coming back with battle damage. And in order to keep their fleets working, they had prepared repair facilities so that they could maintain them and keep them sailing. Now, many of these repair facilities were quite simple structures. This is a typical gridiron, which had been in use before the war as well. The landing craft would sail over it at high water, and then as the tide drops, it's deposited on these beams and men can get underneath to clean off the bottom of the hull. A slightly more complex structure was the bow-on hauling out slip. Now this is difficult to describe from this photograph taken in Salcombe, but this plan gives you a bit more of an idea. Essentially it's a very big cradle which can winch a landing craft out of the water with its bow leading. And this meant that routine maintenance could be carried out, engines could be changed and so forth. And here's a picture of a landing craft having been hauled out of the water. Now these were great because more work could be carried out, but they could only service one landing craft at a time. And the Admiralty realised they would need more than that. And so they built even larger broadside slips where up to 5 landing craft at a time could be hauled out of the water and serviced. And these really were some of the best ways to repair landing craft en masse from the battle damage that they had acquired on D-Day and in the days and weeks following those initial landings. And in fact, this landing craft here was one that was damaged on D-Day. It's photographed here on the 12th of June, having the battle damage repaired. And in fact, you can see some of that battle damage just down there. And in this way, because of this pre-preparedness, the Royal Navy were able to keep their landing craft flotillas well maintained. And you can see that from the 6th of June to the 31st of July, so almost 2 months, the following ships and major craft were taken in hand for repair and completed. 238 landing craft were repaired over that 2-month period. So that's more than 4 a day that are being repaired and put through the repair facilities and then back out to sea to carry troops over to Normandy. And in this way, the landing craft were able to maintain this constant shuttle service from the south coast of England over to France, building up the Allied forces so that they could eventually break out from Normandy in August and then chase the German army across France and into Belgium. And in fact, the scale of that is easily shown in this document produced shortly afterwards by the commander of Portsmouth Naval Base. And this shows all of the sailings by all types of ships from the period of 6th of June to July the 31st, so again just under 2 months inclusive. And this is just Portsmouth Command, so it shows the Isle of Wight area, so the Solent, that includes Leap, Lymington, Southampton and Portsmouth, Portland area and New Haven area. And the most interesting figure there is the one for LCT, Landing Craft Tank, and in total there were 3,591 individual sailings from south coast ports within the Portsmouth Command in that 2-month period. It's a phenomenal amount. So that's more than an average of 4 sailings per landing craft that was available to the Royal Navy at the time. Of course, they weren't the only ships that were sailing across the English Channel. The Royal Navy and the US Navy were also relying on a number of ocean-going merchant ships, coasters, hospital ships and tankers. Now, of course, they can't land on beaches because they're deep draft vessels, and so they couldn't use the embarkation hards and they couldn't use the beaches over in Normandy either. They would require their own facilities. In order to use all of these vessels, it was going to be necessary to obtain a port. They could either try and capture one, but the attack on Dieppe in 1942 had shown the risks of that, and it was already anticipated that the Germans would destroy any ports if they thought they were going to lose them. And so the solution that was agreed in the Quebec Conference in Canada in 1943 was to take some ports with us to Normandy. And this is, of course, the very famous Mulberry Harbours. One was built off Omaha Beach at Vierville-sur-Mer, and one was built at Arromanches in the British sector. Now, I've drawn the rough outline of the size of the harbours there. That's actually to scale. They were vast port facilities, stretching more than a mile out into the water. And Mulberry can sometimes be quite hard to understand. It looks quite complicated as to what's happening, but it's actually relatively simple because it's just like any port that we have here on the south coast of England. So if we were to compare this to Dover, which is actually much smaller than Mulberry B at Gold Beach, you have 2 primary features to any port. You have the outer, breakwater, and then you have the port facilities where the ferries come alongside and all of the holidaymakers don't get on anymore because we can't do that anymore. Welcome to 2020. Mulberry is much the same. You have the port facilities, the piers, which are actually floating and stretch out into the deeper water where the deep draft vessels are capable of coming alongside. And then outside of that you have the harbour walls. And these are the very famous Phoenix caissons that were built here in Britain and then towed across and sunk in place to form a continuous wall, a continuous breakwater around this brand new harbour. And these are probably the most famous aspects of the Mulberry Harbours, certainly the most visible. And they were built primarily in dry docks all along the south coast of England. This is Southampton. This is dry dock number 5, looking towards what is now the National Oceanography Centre, would be just over there. And there are 2 Phoenix caissons under construction here. And when they're finished, the dry dock would be flooded and they would be floated out. But all of these dry docks, even then, there still wasn't enough space to construct the required number of Phoenix caissons. And so the Army and the War Office realised they were going to need more of them, and they hit on the solution of building them on beaches. And they chose 4 locations within the Solent area: at Leap, next to one of the embarkation hards, 2 sites at Stokes Bay, again next to the embarkation hards there, and 1 site at Hayling Island. And the idea was that at these facilities the caissons would be built immediately on the waterfront, usually partially built so that at least they could be floated away and taken to some of the docks and harbours along the south coast where they could be completed to their full height. They'd be launched down purpose-built slipways into the water. So all of this infrastructure had to be prepared for this massive engineering undertaking. Smaller facilities were used as well. If any of you know the River Bewley, I'm sure you do. Just before you get to Buckler's Hard, on the left side there is a small inlet called Clob Copse. And that was an old oyster beds. But it was taken over by the War Office in 1944. It was drained and a cofferdam was built across the front of it. And it was used for the construction of various facilities, of various aspects that would be necessary for Mulberry Harbour, primarily beetle floats. And once these had all been constructed, the cofferdam was taken down, it was flooded, and the beetle floats were then towed out down the River Bewley and round to Southampton for the assembly. And these beetle floats, again mainly concrete, some were made of metal, were the vital floating pontoons for the piers that led out to the pier heads for the deep draft vessels to come alongside. And in fact, it's these aspects of Mulberry Harbour and all of this concrete that leaves one of the largest archaeological traces of the D-Day landings. And Mulberry Harbour, or the remains of it, can be found all across Europe. And you might wonder what on earth all these green dots are so far inland in France, or all of those brown dots up on the Dutch coast. Well, the Dutch coast is easily explained. We still had a number of Phoenix caissons at the end of the war that hadn't been used. And in 1953, after the Great North Sea Storm, after many dikes on the Dutch coast had been breached by the weather, we sold them some of our caissons so they could block up those dikes and then rebuild them around the concrete structures. And this is at, I forget the name of the town, it's on, it'll come to me later, but anyway, they're still there. The dike was rebuilt around those structures, and here at the Watersnood Museum, they have actually been turned into a museum. So you can go inside down at the bottom end, then you walk through all 4 caissons and come out the top end. And you can see inside a piece of Mulberry Harbour. And the museum is very good. This is the library section, but it gives you a real taste of the construction of these. These are probably some of the best preserved examples of Phoenix caissons left in the world. And all of those green dots inland in France, well, they're pieces of the Whale roadways that still exist. As the Allied armies advanced, they had largely blown up bridges to prevent the Germans from reinforcing themselves, and then when the Germans left, they blew them up again. And so there were many gaps across rivers all across France, and as Mulberry Harbour wound down, we had lots of these spare Whale roadways left over, and so a great many of them were used to replace those bridges, and many of them, as you can see, are still in use in France today. Very little change. They have regular maintenance, but they still work absolutely perfectly. Of course, we have lots of Mulberry Harbour on the south coast of England. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this one at Langston Harbour. This is almost certainly, although I still haven't found the paperwork to prove it, almost certainly one of the ones that was launched at Hayling Island and then had to be towed out the way very quickly because it had developed a fault. It's either from Hayling Island or it's one of the Stokes Bay ones, but my money is on Hayling Island. In Southampton, I'm sure many of you are aware, there is a Whale roadway, part of the old Red Funnel terminal. Red Funnel actually purchased these components from the military, and then Southampton Harbour Authority purchased them off of Red Funnel, built this facility for their ferries, which were in fact converted World War II landing craft. The Norris Castle was ex-LCT 939, I think. And the roadway would be used for vehicles to get onto the ferry, and believe it or not, this piece is also a piece of Mulberry Harbour, a buffer pontoon. Again, a floating surface for a landing craft to be able to drop its bow ramp onto. Those, incidentally, were listed in 2017, so they're now protected legally, and if any development happens there, then they will have to incorporate that into their plans. Across the other side of Southampton Water, just south of Marchwood, again, some of you may know there's a large number of beetles as well that were used as a sort of cofferdam in the 1950s when all of these marshes were reclaimed. So they built up the cofferdam across the front with the beetles and then filled in all of the land behind it, giving you a very solid surface. And again, these are very well preserved structures. And as some of you know, and a couple of you have very kindly provided me with some images of, this is Steve. Thank you, La Roche Bernard. The bridge had been destroyed during the war in Brittany, and so again Mulberry provided a very suitable replacement for, as I understand it, a number of years as a safe means of crossing the road. Crossing the river. The one problem with these Mulberry roadways is they're only wide enough for one vehicle, so they can only ever be one way at a time, and that is why in fact some of the bridges are being replaced in France. There is one of these bridges that still exists across a river in northern France today, which uses 5 of these whale roadways to cross the river. It's been there since the Second World War. It's always been one way, so it's a traffic light junction on a main road, and they are now replacing it. And in fact they think they finished the bridge, and they're now dismantling the Mulberry Bridge, which all of the components will now go to Armada on the Normandy coast. And although this bridge has now gone, it's been replaced, and the original road bridge has been rebuilt, there are still elements of that structure to be found today. And as I understand it, in this photograph kindly provided by Steve via Andrew Sutherland, or the other way around, this is part of the original structure for the whale roadways to lead across the water. And so some of it is still there. Looking at the other side of the river on Google Maps, it looks like the other side has gone now. They appear to be developing that with a new marina. So the partner of this on the other side of the river is no longer there. But we do still have a lot of archaeology of Mulberry Harbour and also its construction. So over at Hayling Island, these are actually those Phoenix caissons being constructed in the spring of 1944. And they were built side by side on this long concrete pathway, if you like. They were actually built on keel blocks, which had been purpose-built. You can just see them there. They were then towed along this construction facility to the purpose-built slipway, and then they were launched into the mouth of Langstone Harbour at high tide. And this is actually footage of Hayling Island in 1944. You can see it's actually only been partially built. All of the scaffolding on top is where the top part of the superstructure will be completed in Portsmouth Dockyard before it is towed over to Normandy. So they were only half constructing them on the beach. If they'd fully constructed them, they would never have been able to move them into the water in the first place. And Langstone Harbour, after the war, the construction facility was still there. And looking at the ferry pub there and looking south, you can see all of those keel blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4 separate construction areas. And you might be forgiven for thinking that all of that's gone now, but in fact, although it appears to have gone, a lot of it is still there. And in fact, the Citizen Archaeology project that look at intertidal archaeology along the south coast, they visited last year. And you can see actually a large amount of the concrete preparation area just there, but also that the car park is actually just the filling in of the keel blocks. So all they did was take that existing construction area, fill it with earth and gravel, and turn it into a car park. And so the keel blocks now serve as particularly wide car parking bays. It's probably the most generous car parking bays anywhere in England, in fact. And similarly, at Leap Country Park in the New Forest, you will find evidence of these construction sites. A slightly different design of construction site was used here, with large broad platforms, and then separate keel blocks were placed on top of those, timber keel blocks, and then they were towed along these facilities with winches, and this is one of the anchor points for the winches, and then over to the launching slipways. And these all survive in quite good condition. But of course Leap also has the other facility that was built there, the Embarcation Hard, or Q2 Embarcation Hard, and there is again a lot of archaeology, a lot of visible trace of that. These are the chocolate blocks, or the beach hardening mats, that were laid in the intertidal area for that Embarcation Hard. And in fact, Leap is the only Embarcation Hard in the country that still has 2 of its surviving dolphins of the original pier. But you'll forgive me for saying that they are very much on their last legs. And I do say, as I've said this at every talk I've ever given where I've mentioned Leap, they will probably go this winter. Every year they've surprised me and they've held out. A colleague and I actually went out and did a proper archaeological survey of this sight these two dolphins in August, and they're in better condition than I thought. There are actually some holes in the legs, which are actually, I forget the name of the actual design, but they're cofferdam legs. They've just been placed back to back. So they're incredibly thick pieces of metalwork, rather than the original timber that was primarily used. And in fact, I discovered with some more research, this is why they survived. These were additional dolphins that were constructed to control the swing of boats when they were berthing at this site. So the original timber pier by 1949 was incredibly dilapidated, and this just fits within Southampton Harbour Authority's area, and they said this is too dangerous and they demolished it. The contractor who was tasked with this task said he left these because they were metal, they were too much trouble to remove, and they were in much better condition. So I don't think that any of them expected them to still be here 70 years later, but indeed they are. And you can see these facilities in use on D-Day itself. So this is Embarkation Hard S4 in Southampton, and this is actually the build-up to D-Day. These are men of the 50th Northumbrian Division who are bound for Gold Beach and taking their vehicles on. This is a very wide landing craft, and that was a very small carrier, I hasten to add, so it can actually turn around on the deck, so it didn't need to reverse on, but normally they would. And looking back onto the Embarkation Hard, the landing craft prepares to sail. This again was a far more substantial Embarkation Hard. You can see that actually they've got metal pilings and concrete dolphins. And there you can see its code number for the ships approaching it, S4. And in the background's the gas towers of Northam. Now, that site after the war was photographed in 1949, and you can see again those concrete dolphins. The pier has been removed, but the dolphins remain, as does the concrete of the Embarkation Hard. But it was very much lost in the sort of industrial jumble of Northam back then in the 1940s and 1950s. But it's now completely lost because that site has been almost completely redeveloped. As I'm sure many of you know, of course there's a football stadium there today, and the entire Embarkation Hard, the wharf has been extended and so completely built over. In fact, the very last trace of that Embarkation Hard was removed when the football stadium was built, and they built this miniature roundabout across the last remaining bits of the concrete access road. I often wonder how many people who don't go to St Mary's Stadium anymore because they're not allowed realise that it is in fact right next door to an embarkation area for D-Day. Fortunately, across the Solent area there are better preserved examples of these embarkation facilities. This is Stokes Bay, and again this is original colour footage shot by the Canadians of their forces embarking on the Force J landing craft bound for Juno Beach. And these are what are known as Hobart's Funnies, the various different Royal Engineer tanks of all sorts of different weapons and designs, fascines, bridge layers, mine flails. These would be the first tanks to land on Juno Beach on D-Day. And the embarkation hards there, as I said, there were 4 of them in Stokes Bay, are shown here in this Admiralty plan from the 1940s, and you can see the 2 embarkation hards G1 and G2, and over there is the Historical Diving Museum at Battery number 2. That area looks as if it's been completely redeveloped today, but in fact some of you will recognise the car parks Alverstoke West and Alverstoke East, and if you look back at that Admiralty chart you'll see that in fact they are exactly where the embarkation hards are, and if you were to park your car there and to walk around onto the beach side, you will see that in fact that's all that it is. It's just that concrete base that was laid for the concrete apron in the 1940s, and all that's happened is they've tarmacked over the surface of it. So that is your parking on the original hard standing for vehicles waiting to embark on their landing craft. And if you go down into the foreshore, if it's been a particularly strong storm, then quite often now these chocolate blocks or beach hardening mats are being exposed. And just last week somebody sent me a photo on Twitter and said, Steve, I've never seen this many chocolate blocks exposed at this car park. And yeah, I think the storms are getting stronger, and so it's exposing more of them that have of course been covered over by previous storms and so forth. But far more remains there than people actually realised. And as you go along the promenade towards the yacht club and so forth, you'll see all of this concrete structure. This was part of the access facilities and the Mulberry Harbour construction site. A little further up the harbour, at the very top, next to Horsey Island, next to the M275 in fact. Some of you might recognise this. You might see it occasionally as you drive out of Portsmouth, these long angular structures that poke out into the water, and you may well have wondered what on earth they are. Well, they're very visible on Google Earth, and they're very well established, and yeah, as I said, very visible at low tide. And in fact, it's these very slips that I showed you. And in fact, you can see Portsdown Hill in the background, and that's Fort Widley. And these are the landing craft damaged on D-Day being repaired on the 12th of June. And that structure is still very much there. In fact, the best preserved of these repair facilities, although you do find them all along the south coast. This is the River Tamar on the other side of the Tamar from Plymouth. And just underneath the bridge, you can see that that repair facility slip there. If you go to Salcombe, and the very nice Mill Beach, that little triangular beach just down there, you will find this very large lump of concrete sticking out of the sand, and you might wonder what it is. It is this very same repair facility in this photograph, the bow-on slip for hauling landing craft out of the water. At Southampton again, if you go underneath the Itchen Bridge, so that's the rowing club. Itchen Bridge is just here. And this is the Scout Hut, the Sea Scout Hut, and there's this sort of slipway into the water, and it all looks a bit sort of broken up and run down, doesn't it? But that's because it's quite an old facility, and these two bow-on repair slips were constructed in the late 1943 in order to ensure there were sufficient repair facilities for all of the landing craft taking part in D-Day. Oh, sorry, that's there, yes. Just north of the Itchen Bridge. But elsewhere in Southampton, there are other examples of all of this infrastructure, and including some of the roads that I told you about as well. For those of you who know Southampton Common, coming off of Hill Lane on the west side, up in the northwest corner, there's a road that leads onto the Common, like all of the other ones, and all of the corners and gates on Southampton Common. But this one, again, we can trace its origins back directly to the Second World War and the build-up for D-Day, because this is the War Office construction plan requiring it to be built, new road referred to. And this was a brand new access road onto Southampton Common, which was being turned into a marshalling camp for D-Day. And there it still is to this day, another piece of World War II D-Day infrastructure built in the 1940s. At Mount Edgecombe, just outside Plymouth, on the west side of Plymouth Harbour, I showed you this this plan earlier, with all of the improvements that have been made, and it's all still visible. It's all still there. The tar macadam laid road coming up from the house, and then these concrete roads that lead down to the embarkation hards. Miles of this stuff exists all along the coast and inland. Here on the east side of the Fell, I think I said west earlier, this is the east side of the Fell, south of Truro, all of these red dots showing where brand new passing places were to be installed. You don't have to go far along that road to find them in exactly where the dots were shown. So a lot of the lay-bys that we see on the lanes all around Cornwall and Devon, they were built purely for the traffic that would be heading down to the embarkation hards to get onto their vessels for D-Day. This one that I showed you earlier, where the shaded areas were people's houses, this is in a place called Millbrook, just outside Plymouth, on the run down to Edgecombe Country Park. And you can see why the road needed widening, because in its existing form it's not particularly wide, so they needed these passing places, and this is that lay-by that was constructed. 3 houses demolished, and so there's a modern house here that has been built in the gardens of those properties. So changes that D-Day left upon our landscape and our road networks are still very much apparent. And hopefully I've got these slides in the right order. If we had to look closer to home in the New Forest, we can again see some of those changes. This is Jacob's Gutter Lane running from Marchwood and Hive up to Totton. And before the Marchwood bypass was built, this was of course the main road out of the east side of the New Forest and round to Southampton. And so it was the main route for vehicles and troops who were camped in the New Forest to reach Southampton docks. And so in order to make sure that road was wide enough, it needed to be widened to accommodate the convoys. And you can see on the sides of the roads those telltale white lines, the concrete strips where the road has been widened. And after a lot of Google Street View and looking around with the clues that were attached to this footage that just said near Totton, I was eventually able to work out exactly where these locations were. This is Jacob's Gutter Lane in Totton, and that is the same place. And then this place, slightly closer to where we are now, you take us? Yes, Bewley. This is the main road out of Bewley to the east. And in fact, it's very little change today because those cottages are still there. And I often think as I drive up it, the only reason I can pass oncoming vehicles is because it was widened so that tanks could pass one another for D-Day. At Leap, as I was talking about earlier, all of those passing places that would be provided where necessary. Oh, sorry, the other thing that was required was a new concrete road, and this is just outside the main visitor centre at Leap. Once rainfall has washed away some of the sides of the road, you can see that it's actually just made up of the original World War II concrete, and it's just been tarmacked over the top. And those passing places that were required every 200 yards, they're all the way down Leap Road between Langley and Leap Country Park itself. So it's all still very evident. Now, if we're to bring all of this infrastructure and all of this preparedness together, then where better to do it than Lymington? So obviously we're down at the bottom, just there. And an embarkation yard was built in Lymington, started in 1942, completed in 1943. And it was built just up there, just north of the main ferry terminal. In fact, what was used as the ferry terminal for quite some time. Now, this slipway, if you like, existed before the war, but it was much smaller, and so it was expanded to accommodate vessels to accommodate landing craft primarily. It was shored up, the sides were improved, and dolphins were installed. The dolphins, of course, now removed. This is one of the Admiralty plans of the site. It's not very easy to interpret, but you've got the railway line coming down here, strengthening up the sides of the quay, if you like. There's the slip. Here are the dolphins that are to be built. And of course, here's a much better diagram I found, which is actually discussing the demolition of it should there be a German invasion, because in 1942 we were still anticipating that possibility. This one's much easier to interpret because it's much simpler. The railway line is quite obvious. There would be 4 charges buried in that slip to be detonated in the event of a German invasion so that the Germans wouldn't be able to use it. This was all planned in the winter of 1942, and then in late winter of 1942, Churchill decreed to Home Command that we must now go on a fighting offensive and a more offensive spirit. There would be no more talk of this sort of defence preparation. And so these explosives, you'll be pleased to know, were never installed. And on the site plan, you can't make out, I'm afraid it's a bit blurry, but just there it says Blake's. And I found out when I gave this talk online that Blake's house was the clubhouse? Yes, was the clubhouse. I think it must be that building in this photograph that I've pinched off the internet, a gent called Rob Chilverton, who apparently, that's his father's car, boarding one of the ferries. And this is that World War II slip, extended in the Second World War to accommodate more landing craft, but then saw considerable use after D-Day for passenger ferries. And Blake's house was the hardmaster's office and the main control room for this embarkation yard. Now, this required a lot of improvements to the local area around Lymington, and in April 1943 a letter was sent. With reference to this letter, dated 25th of March, I enclosed 6 copies of a drawing showing the work required for the approach road to the Hard. This work includes the resurfacing in Tarmacadam of the section of road from the B3054 down to Lymington Pier, and the construction of a concrete apron on the carriageway at the entrance to the pier. I find that very interesting because it's shown here in this plan. The red is Tarmacadam, heading south from the 3054, and here's the pier, and the blue indicates the concrete that is to be laid, this hard standing in front of the pier entrance. It's very interesting that there is a very obvious surface change just outside the entrance to the Isle of Wight ferry. Just there. This is a recent Google Street View photo. Older ones show the same change in surface level, and it's interesting that they've resurfaced this area of the road and they've gouged it deeper, but here they haven't needed to, and I suspect that's because the original concrete is still underneath. So when you drive into the Isle of Wight ferry, not that you're a sailing club, you don't use this, but you're probably driving over World War II concrete. That letter also said it is anticipated that further works may be required at the transit area for this site, in which case particulars will be forwarded to you at an early date. And then this letter was subsequently sent in August, detailing various improvements that were going to need to be made to an area just to the north of Lymington, in fact around Pilley and Boulder. And this area needed to be redeveloped to turn it into a transit area, or what was essentially a very large parking area, all around Pilley and Boulder, between the A337, between Lymington and Brockenhurst, all the way over to Pilley. This would essentially turn into one large tank park. And the War Office dispatched this plan showing resurfacing that would need to be carried out, Tarmacadam in red and concrete in blue down School Lane and 100 Lane. And so the extent of the improvements that were carried out are all around the road network in those villages just north of here. And if we were to look at Pilley, for instance, some of you may have driven through here before, and you see all of this shaded areas, those indicate tank parks. And of course that is why the road is so wide around there. That surface was laid in the Second World War, and so rather than dig it up when the war has ended, you might as well just tarmac over it and turn it into a parking area, and so that is what's been done. School Lane and 100 Lane, just coming off Pilley Street, this entire area was to be resurfaced in concrete because it was in fact just a dirt lane at the time. And so if you drive down it now, when you come to the corner, you can in fact see the concrete under the surface and the, it's moved on for some reason, and the original layout of the concrete underneath. And even at the far west end over in Boulder, where it comes off the A337, all this was road widening, and you might not think that that would be so visible, but actually all the way down that lane you can see that there is a different surface on the south side of the road as indicated in the plans, and that would appear to be where that road was widened from an original single carriageway to accommodate more vehicles. Now, not all of these facilities have survived the last 75 years, of course, and there have been various reasons behind that. Natural processes such as storms. This is in fact in the winter of 1943-1944 at Hive, over near Folkestone, and what's happened here is that massive amounts of shingle have been swept up on the embarkation hard and covered it. And we see much the same today as the coast changes and shifts. And so at Hayling Island, the Mulberry Harbour construction site, well, you can see bits of it there. There are the slipways, the ramps into the water, but that site is changing. And over time, that spit is growing across those slips and essentially burying them. And when Citizen visited last year, in fact, that was all that was exposed. So that site is in a way being preserved because it's being covered over, but it's also being lost from sight. On the other hand, the opposite is very often true. This is Hastings, again in the winter of 1943, and what's happened here is undermining. The gravel underneath the concrete has been swept out and the concrete has collapsed under its own weight. And this is a problem with structures all along the coast, and It's still very much a problem on the south coast. This is Leap, this is the Mulberry Harbour construction site, and you can see the undermining that is happening at that facility, and it's only a matter of time before it eventually collapses. And in fact, some of that has been deliberately done at the north end of this construction site to create this demolition debris to help break up wave action and try and preserve the rest of the site. What am I showing here? Oh yes, the other threat to all of these sites, especially being in the tidal area and at some places in industrial areas, is development. And these are the repair slips that were constructed in 1943 just next to Husband's Boatyard and remained in use. I was very excited when I saw this on Google Earth, and I thought they're still there, absolutely in immaculate condition. Well, unfortunately, I didn't realise that Google Earth was using imagery from a few years ago, and when I looked at more recent imagery, that site has unfortunately been completely cleared. Had it all been there when I first discovered that the site had been constructed there and I realised what had been there, had it still been in place, I would have contacted Historic England and recommended scheduling, because that would have been an incredibly rare site. Unfortunately now, with all of the infrastructure and the blocks of concrete at the back all removed, there's very little left to actually mitigate for. Fortunately, there are projects that look at these sites and try and record them before they are lost to either natural processes or development. And the Citizen project, which stands for the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network, has been running for a number of years, and they've recorded a number of these D-Day sites, amongst other sites. Their remit is all periods. But they are one of the groups that has recorded in great detail the construction site at Leap Country Park. And I was a volunteer for them. I was also doing work with the National Park Authority, and so we've recorded the full scale of these structures, which has been incredibly useful because it means we can build up digital plans of these sites. And that's more useful than you might think, because we don't have original construction plans for this site. We know a great deal about the Phoenix caissons that were built here, but we know very little about the construction site itself, which, as I said, all had to be purpose-built. And so these archaeological records are the only records that we actually have. And they can be turned into something far more interesting than these GIS maps. With all of the information we're able to gather, it's possible to create proper interactive three-dimensional maps. And this one was produced by Wessex Archaeology on behalf of the New Forest National Park, and you can find this online. Just Google Leap Embarkation 3D model and you'll find it, and you can zoom in and pan around this and see the embarkation yard and construction site as we believe it would have looked in the spring of 1944. Citizen, of course, in this very unusual year that we've had, have found different ways to engage with the public without being able to actually go out and see them, and so I partook in this because the project manager for Citizen is my wife, and so one of the little activities that we did online in the spring was to recreate famous scenes of the D-Day embarkation, making use of that nickname of chocolate blocks. I hasten to add that no chocolate was harmed in the process of making these, and I ate it all later. It also gives us the opportunity to study and learn much more about the concrete facilities that were built. So for Mulberry Harbour, for instance, we can do research into all of the individual caissons. The records for the Mulberry Harbour caissons themselves are extremely detailed, unlike the construction sites. And so we have all of this information about where each individual caisson was taken after it was built, where it was stored, then who towed it over to Normandy, where it was sunk in the breakwater, and what happened to it. And we can also use aerial photographs and other sources of information to study it in much more detail. So if we just look at the western breakwater of the Mulberry Harbour B, Port Winston at Arromanches, we can look very closely and we can see, I can't, that's not me saying that. You can see all of these individual caissons along the western breakwater. And they were all sunk individually in position, but they all had unique identities that were recorded by the Admiralty. They were all given code numbers. And we can use these maps and plans to work out which caisson is which in these photographs. And then we can trace those caissons through time through into the late 1940s and then up to the present day. So we can actually follow what has happened to that structure over the past 75 years. Now, as you can see, there's far less visible today, but fortunately the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office did a survey about 6 years ago of this site, and they revealed what is still under the water there. And so using that information, we can actually increase the scale of what we can see in that aerial photograph, and we can relabel them all again. And when we know their identities, we can trace those identities back to their construction. And so we can stand on the cliffs at Arromanches and we can look at these facilities and we can identify those individual casemates. Caissons, and we can say where they were built. So at the back we have ones that were built in the London docks, and then at the front 2 that were built at Stokes Bay, and this one, which hasn't survived quite so well, at Stone Point Leap. And we can also do this not just for concrete but for people as well. By going back through the historical records and narratives, we can find out more about the individual units that we know all about in France, but we can find out what they were doing in the UK beforehand. This is one of the Sherman Crab flail tanks, one of Hobart's funnies, the first tanks to land in Normandy. And this picture actually gives us a wealth of information, because if we look down at the very front of the flail, we get this little identification thing, and it has lots of information. You can see there the triangle, the bull's head identification symbol of the 79th Armoured Division, Hobart's division. The 29964 is the unit identification for the Westminster Dragoons, and then in chalk, really, really faint, this number 2026. That number is the key number for anyone researching landing craft and who they carried on D-Day. It's called the Landing Table Index number, and it is essentially the code number that was applied to every vessel load for D-Day. So any group of vehicles that was going to be on the same landing craft would all carry the same Landing Table Index number. And there were thousands of these numbers because there were thousands of vessels, and they are the key to understanding what units carried. There is no table which tells you which landing craft had which landing table index number. You have to work it out through photograph analysis and looking at records and reports. Usually you have to have 5 documents open at the same time to try and work that sort of thing out. But where they're crucial is they appear on the embarkation timetables. This is Force G for Gold Beach's embarkation timetable, and this is for HARD's Q2, which is Leap. And it shows us all of the embarkation that's going to happen on D-3 and D-2, which is the days before D-Day, at Stanswood Bay, as I said, Leap. And then down here we have that number again, 2026. That's the landing table index number. That tells us that that Sherman Crab flail of the Westminster Dragoons embarked on its landing craft from Q2 embarkation hard at Leap on D-2, which isn't the 4th of June because D-Day was delayed by 24 hours, so in fact it's the 3rd of June. They spent an extra day on their landing craft bobbing around in the Solent. So, also going back through the war diaries of the Westminster Dragoons, now that we've identified that unit, we can start to actually trace that vehicle's route down to its embarkation hard from its marshalling camp, and we can plot that journey from Langley in the New Forest down to the embarkation hard at Stanswood Bay. And then of course we can plot the archaeological remains that are still visible, all of those improvements that were carried out on that stretch of road, all of the evidence of the Second World War that we can see on that journey. We can actually plot archaeology directly to the historical record, which is essentially what we want to achieve from archaeology anyway. It's all about finding out what people were doing in the past and finding historical, physical evidence for it. And we can do that here in Lymington as well, so it's slightly closer to home. Some of you may know that at the quay there is a little blue plaque just there on the end of the wall. And it says on it, from this river on the 3rd of June 1944 sailed the 2nd Battalion of the Essex Regiment, or the Pompadours, to take part in Operation Overlord, landing in Normandy on the 6th of June and liberating Bayeux the following day, which is all absolutely true. I would say though that a lot of people assume, because this plaque is here at Town Quay, that this is where they embarked, and that's not the case. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the main embarkation facility was next to the ferry terminal, and that is where it had been built. Now, a lot of the confusion, which is also replicated not just in that plaque, but in museums and other books and historical records, and even Historic England, believe that it was actually on the west side of the river, and this plan, which appears to point to an embarkation yard on the west side, would seem to support that. But as we know, the embarkation facility is actually on the east side, and that's where the road network is leading to. It's just that the cross to mark that embarkation yard is slightly offset of where it's meant to be. But it means that many people believe it was the other side of the river, but definitely the east, as the road shows where the soldiers will go in order to get on their landing craft. In fact, Lymington was briefly considered to not be used at all, and it wasn't until an experiment was held in 1943 with Landing Craft Tank Mark V, with night approaches and daytime approaches at various states of the tide to see how easy it was to actually navigate into Lymington, that the decision was made that it would be possible to use for D-Day, but they did say that it is also considered that it is only suitable for LCT who are familiar with local conditions and have practice there. And I'm sure that you probably would agree with that, given that the amount of mudflats on either side of the channel leading into Lymington. In the end, landing craft tank weren't used here at Lymington. In fact, they used a different type of vessel, LCIL, Landing Craft Infantry Large. And you can see quite clearly, it says Lymington A Hard, the one at the ferry terminal. And it also gives us, crucially, those really useful landing table index numbers. And you can see there's 10 of them for 10 vessels. So Lymington was used by 10 vessels to embark troops of 56 Brigade, of whom the 2nd Essex were a part. But they weren't the only part of 56 Brigade, and in fact we can look at the loads for all of those individual landing table index numbers in the historical record, and we can start to correct some myths. As you can see, this is a landing craft infantry large. It's far too large to fit it into Town Quay. It definitely used the embarkation facility on the east side of the river. But if we also look at the landing tables, the complete lists for all of those landing table index numbers, we see that it wasn't just the 2nd Essex who were embarking here in Lymington. It was in fact all the 56 Brigade. And that's 3 battalions of infantry, not just the 2nd Essex Battalion, but also the 2nd Gloucestershire Regiment, and I think it was the 4th Battalion, the South Wales Borderers. So the 2nd Essex were literally just 1/3. In fact, probably less, 1/4 when you add all of the additional Royal Engineers and Royal Army Service Corps and other affiliated units that were attached to that brigade. And in fact, this was the embarkation area for 3 whole regiments of infantry, not just the Essex Regiment. So these, oh sorry, and this is them landing on Gold Beach on D-Day itself. So in this way, these concrete roads and these reminders of D-Day, they give us the impetus to study more about why they were constructed, but also the impetus to investigate more about who used them. And in doing so, we can judge their significance, if they were used by a particularly large body of men or a particularly famous unit. Or we can establish if memorials need updating because there are in fact far more units using a place than had previously been believed. And in this way, they're not just lumps of concrete, they're very tangible reminders of the events of the Second World War, and in particular of D-Day itself. And I think this is important because last year, of course, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and this year was the 76th with somewhat more mooted commemorations. And we're now in the period of the 80th anniversary of the Second World War. And whether we like it or not, we are reaching a stage where our veterans are slowly leaving us. And it won't be long before we have no veterans left, through the same process that we went through as we did for the First World War. And so in time, we won't have anyone else to talk to about these sites. We will only have the sites themselves. But perhaps by having these physical very tangible reminders in the countryside and on the coast. We can use them to inspire new generations to study the events of the Second World War and treat them as more permanent reminders of the events of the 1940s. So I, for one, enjoy studying concrete for this reason, believe it or not. And I do hope that many more of them will be recognised for their true significance. If you have found the subject of concrete mind-numbingly interesting, then you can follow me on Twitter, where I talk about it quite a lot, along with Coastal Forces. And I have found a Facebook page that I set up, and I have not updated at all. But I will periodically add more stuff to that if Facebook is your thing. And also the Citizen Project, who carry out lots of research at these sites, among others, are very active, and they have been right the way through 2020, in fact. And you can find out more about their work and some of the sites they've investigated on their website at citizen.org.uk. And I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I realise that there may be some hungry tummies in here, but
I realise I've overrun massively, haven't I?
We've probably got time for a question or two. Yes.
All this infrastructure must have required quite a lot of planning. Did that fall under Admiral Ramsey and his planners, or was the separate organisation working closely with him?
So who was it who was responsible for all of the planning for all of this infrastructure? It was split between the War Office and the Admiralty. And in typical administrative fashion, everything below the low water mark was taken care of by the Admiralty, and everything above it was taken care of by the War Office. In the main, though, the structures that were directly connected to the embarkation hards were overseen by the Admiralty. But as soon as it became something related to traffic for convoys and that sort of thing, then the War Office oversaw it. So it was split between those two main commands, also Combined Operation Headquarters who were ordering it. So it was mainly Mountbatten who oversaw most of this stuff rather than Ramsey per se. But of course the vast majority of it was handed out to Southern Command for the Army. And then Plymouth, Portsmouth and Dover commands for the Navy. And of course they just delegated almost all of their work to civilian contractors. So yeah, in typical bureaucratic fashion, it went through multiple layers, I think, and multiple organisations.
Thank you. You said you had difficulty in tracing details about the construction sites. Now I used to work for John Lang's and Wimpey's, both of which are no longer with us, but I do get their magazines, and every so often they have photographs of the Second World War and the work they did during the Second World War. Have you thought of applying to them, because there are archives with lots of photographs of what work they did, and they may be able to help you?
Yes, I have had trouble, I'll admit, trying to trace exactly which units which companies merged into the following companies, and then who has that archive. So it's always useful to know where these companies sort of went and who they are now, so I know who to contact. And it was something I was going to start doing this year. But I sort of put on the back burner for the time being. But yes, if you do actually know one of the organisations, I'd be very keen to know. Lovely, that'd be grand. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. And one final question: the plaque for the Essex Regiment. I mean, I go down there every year and put a wreath down there as part of my job at the town council. I mean, are you suggesting we should move it and then get a better plaque?
Oh, good Lord, no.
56th Brigade and put the others, I mean, because the South Wales Borderers and the Gloucesters might be upset about it.
I don't think they're upset. I don't think you need to change the memorial per se. I'm often curious as to how these sort of memorials come about, and I suspect, given that you've got the Essex Regiment's badge on there, it might have been that the Essex Regiment approached Lymington Rotary Club in the first place many moons ago, or maybe there was a veteran in Lymington Rotary Club and that's how it came about. It's quite often how these things come about, and there isn't always necessarily a massive amount of research carried out behind them because they've been done at an extremely local level, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it does mean, because a lot of the time soldiers didn't know even where they were, a lot of people don't know where they embarked from, and they wouldn't have known who else was embarking from there either. And so this is probably, extremely local formation of this plaque. I think what I'm trying to do, and what other researchers such as myself are trying to do, is inform the public record better, so that in the future if memorials like this are built, or if they're enhanced or anything, then they can be more more completely done. The interesting thing about a lot of this research is that nobody's done it before. You would think that it would be very easy nowadays to find out who embarked where, and that there would be a database online where you could just click and see, this unit embarked here and they landed here, and this embarkation facility was used by this unit and this unit and this unit. It doesn't exist. The only way you can find this sort of information out is going through the primary records at the National Archives and piecing it together. So what I'm trying to do is do that and turn it into a comprehensive historical data set, so that in the future, memorials could be built at other locations and they would be complete.
Thank you.
Right, one final question.
Yes, thank you very much. My question involves the Isle of Wight, which you haven't mentioned a huge amount.
No.
Were some D-Day resources pre-positioned on the Isle of Wight? And I'm specifically thinking of the slipway that seems to be the beach-hardened variety, half a mile to the west of the entrance to Newtown River.
Ooh, I know what that is. Yes, the Isle of Wight. So the Isle of Wight wasn't hugely used in the build-up to D-Day because you would have to move all of that infrastructure across the Solent to prepare it. But then not only that, you'll have to move all of the troops across the Solent to embark them as well, which just means double embarking. And so the Isle of Wight wasn't massively used. It was used for Pluto, of course, the pipeline under the ocean, which I haven't talked a huge amount about. That went from Hamble underneath the Southampton Water to Thorley, and then across land to Leap, and then across to Thingy Bay, just west of Cowes. Foreness Bay, I think. No, the concrete that you're thinking of, I suspect, was the submarine indicator loop. So this was a device using electrical current that was laid across the seabed to detect submarines through magnetism, which would pass a current through this cable, and then you would be able to detect that the vessel had passed. Of course, if you knew that the vessel was passing because you could see it out the window, you know what it is. If it's a submarine underwater, you wouldn't be able to see it, but the indicator loop would detect it. And if the concrete you're talking about is where I think it is, I think that's it. There was no embarkation from the Isle of Wight for the reason I mentioned, because it would be far too complicated logistically to get all of those troops over to the Isle of Wight and then onto a ship a second time, so they didn't bother. But as I said, Pluto was used, and also there was a Mulberry parking area at Osborne Bay, between Osborne House and the Isle of Wight ferry terminal at Fishbourne, thank you. Yes, there's a big Mulberry parking area there, and in fact recently I was involved in some archaeological work there that recovered several kite anchors, which are a particular type of anchor developed specially for Mulberry Harbour, and some of them were left there in that parking area, probably by accident, and recently recovered, and they'll hopefully go into the National Museum of the Royal Navy soon. They're being restored at the moment.
The island was actually closed down.
Yes, it was used as a huge troop base in the early part of the 40s, yeah.
Just on the concrete pad at west of Newtown Creek, does it not link across to the obstructions outside Saudi, which it's a straight line across, and I think that carries the cable you're referring
Yes,
to.
it might do. I can't remember what's on this side now because there's so much down there. There's lots of archaeology. I'll check.
Right, thank you all for your questions, and I'd just like to wrap up by thanking Steve very much for presenting
Quite all right.
a wealth of information about where we live, so that we can interpret the South Coast with new eyes. As a part-time researcher myself, I'm staggered by the amount of original information we've been able to find, and I'm sure we're all very grateful. So, on behalf of the Royal Livingston Yacht Club, Steve Fisher, thank you very much for giving us your talk this evening.
Thank you. You're very welcome.